Hello, and welcome to the Wake Up Call podcast. Today, we're speaking with Dr. Mary Ruwart about the FDA and the pharmaceutical industry. Dr. Ruwart is a research scientist, ethicist, and libertarian author and activist. She worked as a senior research scientist for the Upjohn Company, where she was involved in pharmaceutical research related to AIDS and liver cirrhosis. She sought the Libertarian Party's presidential nomination in 1984 and in 2008, and is the author of Healing Our World and Short Answers to Tough Questions. You can follow her work at ruwart.com. That's RUWART.com. For more information, see the show notes page for this episode at wakeupcallpodcast.com/FDA. Dr. Ruwart, welcome to the show.
Well, thank you very much.
So let's start by just talking about the general process of bringing a drug to the market. How do pharmaceutical industries create these drugs, and then how do they bring them to the market for people to buy them?
It's actually a very involved process. From the lab bench to the marketplace is about 14 years. And that doesn't include a lot of research that might have gone on before to figure out which drug they want to take to market. So it's quite involved. And a lot of people, as a result, if they have a terminal illness, they literally die waiting for these new drugs.
What's the biggest impediment there? 14 years. Why does it take so long?
Well, the FDA demands a certain process. Once you've decided you want to take a drug to the marketplace, you have to do studies on the itself to make sure you can manufacture it reproducibly. And you have to then do animal studies to make sure you can give large quantities without seeing any big problems, at least not at the doses you expect to give to people. And then you have to go very slowly through the process of testing it in people. First, you give it to a few volunteers at very low doses, just to make sure you haven't really missed anything big, and then gradually bump up that dose. And then once you've done that in normal, healthy people, generally then you go on to what we call phase 2, which is putting it in people that have whatever illness you're trying to treat and getting some idea of what dose you need to have the desired effect. And once you have that figured out, you then go into phase 3, where you use lots of people. And by lots, I mean probably hundreds to thousands of people to see if the drug works and if the study will give you the statistical significance that the FDA wants. Because if it doesn't, you have to start over. And you need 2 studies like that in the U.S. normally to get a drug approved. So that process takes a long time.
So can you talk a little bit about how that process came to be? I guess the Harris-Kefauver amendments must have had a lot to do with that, but can you go through that whole transition into that process?
Sure. Back in the late 50s, Senator Kefauver felt that people weren't buying enough generic drugs, and that the reason was that the generic drugs didn't work as well as the brand name drugs. And that was true because, some of these drugs, you had to get them in the bloodstream at the right rate for them to work right. And so they weren't really identical drugs because, some of the components were a little different in the capsule.
Quickly, sorry to interrupt, but could you explain the difference between a generic drug and not a generic drug for our listeners who might not know?
Sure. Oh, good point. Yes. Well, back then it was very important to drug companies to have a trusted brand name. So, for example, the Upjohn Company wanted to make sure that all its drugs were working as they promised and didn't have big safety problems, because if they did, people would start saying, "Oh, we don't want to buy Upjohn drugs anymore. They're bad, if they don't work the way they're supposed to, if they're not safe." And so generic drugs were drugs that were kind of knockoffs of, whatever the brand name companies would make. So somebody would imitate, for example, what Upjohn was making. They'd have the same chemical, but the different ingredients in the pills might be different enough, or the particle size of the chemical, the drug, might be different enough that it absorbed differently in the body. And for certain things, especially like diabetics, it was a big problem, because if the drug didn't absorb as you expected, you could take too much of it or too little of it and not control your blood sugar. So Kefauver had this idea that if he made all drugs go through a lot of studies to show that they were equivalent, the brand name was equivalent to the generic, then people would buy more generics. Now, what he didn't think about is how much this would cost to do. So these amendments, these Kefauver-Harris amendments, were kind of languishing in Congress until Europe had a big drug problem. They had put thalidomide on the market as a safer sleeping drug, which it was. It was safer than barbiturates, but it wasn't safe for the unborn babies. And what happened when women took this when they were pregnant, at first they were really happy because they didn't have morning sickness. But then what ended up happening is their babies were born sometimes without limbs or missing a limb or two. And so thalidomide was taken off the market in Europe. We didn't have too much of a problem in the U.S. because the FDA had already said, well, we don't feel very good about approving this drug. So, it had some other problems they were concerned about. So they didn't approve it. And the examiner who had withheld the approval was given an award. She did the right thing for the wrong reasons. And that told the FDA that it was much better to keep a potentially life-saving drug off the market if there were any safety problems at all. And of course, every drug has safety problems. There's not a single drug that you can take that doesn't affect some people badly. Penicillin, which has saved probably millions of lives, kills some people due to an allergic reaction. So no drug is perfectly safe. So if what the FDA did to protect itself is it started demanding more and more and more studies, and it was given the power to do that when the Kefauver-Harris amendments passed in 1962, because now the FDA it could decide to keep a drug off the market if it wasn't effective. And what does effective actually mean? Does it mean 1 in 10 people the drug works in? Does it mean it has to work in everybody just a little bit? The FDA decided it had to work better than placebo in 2 United States studies. So it wouldn't accept any data from Europe. It wouldn't accept a single study. And it wanted the statistical significance to be high. And that's just another way of saying they wanted to be sure that the drug didn't work based on chance, that maybe it was just kind of an oddball study. So they were very rigorous in this. And some of the companies actually fought this for a number of reasons. And what happened is the court said, hey, we're not going to hear these cases. If the FDA wants to take your drug off the market for any reason, a good reason, a bad reason, whatever, we're not going to interfere. The FDA got tremendous power over the entire industry. And that's why this story isn't told a lot, because people in the industry are almost the only ones who know it. And they're afraid to speak up because if they do, the FDA can make life for their company miserable by simply delaying every step of the way in the process by which one develops drugs. Just simply won't give the blessing to the study that, the drug company wants to do.
So I guess in a few minutes here we'll get into a few examples of this, but can you give sort of an overview of the harm caused by all of these delays and all the time it takes to go through the regulations?
Sure.
And just how many people have either died or dealt with debilitating health issues for years and years because they were unable to get these drugs due to these regulations in this process?
Well, a good example are the AIDS patients. When AIDS first was recognized as a disease and the drug companies were trying to find cures, and actually I was involved in that process too, the AIDS patients decided they wouldn't die waiting this 14 years that it was going to take us to get drugs to the market. So what they did is they copied the drugs that we were making. They hired black market chemists to make them, and they distributed them throughout the AIDS community and did it in a pretty a pretty effective way, I think. Now, for the most part, the FDA didn't come after the ones, especially in California. But if you remember the award-winning movie that came out a couple years ago, Dallas Buyers Club with Matt McConaughey, they came after him in Texas. They came after the gentleman that was portrayed in that movie and tried to put him out of business and prosecuted him, actually. And so that's, an example of how unhappy that people are when they die waiting. And the cancer patients actually took the FDA to court because they wanted to be legal. So they were suing for the right to take drugs that had been safety tested in humans but hadn't had effectiveness testing yet. And the courts ruled that, contrary to what the cancer patients asserted, Americans have no constitutional right to save themselves with unapproved drugs. So we still die waiting. Now what's happening is in every state, there's a piece of legislation being proposed called the right to try. And this is essentially the same thing that the cancer patients were trying to get by suing the FDA, but it's passing in, I think, 24 states now have it. And basically, it bypasses the FDA. If the drug company will allow you to have the drug and you are terminally ill, you can get it from the drug company without having to get the FDA's approval. Of course, not all pharmaceutical companies will want to do that because there's probably going to be retaliation by the FDA. But there's a few instances in which this is highly likely to actually happen. And I think this is, it's kind of like what's been happening with the war on drugs state by state. Some drugs are totally legalizing marijuana, for example. And so, they're going counter to what the federal government wants.
So are there any statistics or studies you can refer to give just sort of a general sense of, since these Harris-Kefauver amendments were adopted in 1962, of the deaths that have and other harm that's been caused from these delays?
Mm-hmm. I think a conservative estimate based on my own calculations of deaths due to delays and deaths due to loss of innovation is about 1 out of 5 Americans that have died since 1962 have had their lives shortened.
Wow. That's just staggering.
Well, and if you look at it a different way, if you spread it evenly through the population, it'd probably be each of us have lost a couple years of life. And I want to just remind you that's a conservative estimate, because what I haven't accounted for and have really no good way to account for is how much we've lost, how many lives we've lost, because the FDA actually controls information about inexpensive nutrients and how they can actually prevent disease. So to a large extent, the FDA has delayed us getting that information and so has made us suffer too. In fact, it created what I call the American thalidomide incident, which was much worse than what happened in Europe. There's a B vitamin called folic acid that can prevent babies from being born with spina bifida. And once this was discovered in the early 1980s, obviously the folic acid manufacturers wanted to tell young women, hey, if you're of childbearing age, you really need to be taking folic acid because you need it in the first, month or two of pregnancy. But the FDA told them, the folic acid manufacturers, they would shut them down if they said that. And they even when the Center for Disease Control, another government institution, started saying the same thing, started telling young women they should take folic acid, the FDA said that if the folic acid manufacturers even referred to that recommendation, they would prosecute them. So this is very bad because we went 12 to 15 years without letting young women know that they could prevent these birth defects. And these are serious birth defects. These put children in institutions or have them aborted because you can test for it, in the womb. So this is a very serious thing that the FDA did.
So can you talk a little bit about drug price structures? I know in the news we've heard a lot about a gentleman named Martin Shkreli who hiked up the prices of his drugs. How exactly are drugs priced, and do the long waiting periods and the long periods of testing these drugs greatly affect the way that the drugs are priced?
Yes, obviously, back before the 62 amendments, it was about 4.5 years to get a drug to market. Obviously, if you triple that time, you're going to at least triple the price. But it's usually worse than that because drug manufacturers have a lot of incentive to compress that timeline and be first to market. So they do very extensive testing that probably they wouldn't have to do if they did things sequentially. But to get ahead, they do, many, many doses that they probably won't have to have done in order to get through the process faster. So the cost is enormous. I have calculated it to be somewhere between about 80%, I think is a conservative estimate. 80% of our pharmacy bill are due to regulation testings that don't help us at all from a safety standpoint. So we're essentially throwing 80% of our pharmacy dollar away.
Wow. Now, a lot of the time you'll hear about Americans going to Canada or Mexico or other places to get drugs. Now, I guess Canada has price controls, and there are probably price controls on drugs in a lot of other countries. But how do you explain those stark price differences between countries? Because I would assume there are regulations in Canada and maybe in Mexico and elsewhere. So is there something else contributing to these high prices in the U.S.? Does it still make sense for people to go out of the country to get drugs?
Well, it depends on the drug and it depends on the country what the reason is. In some countries, the regulations aren't as onerous, so the companies can get on the market quicker there, and if they can keep the price lower. Canada is a different situation. In Canada, what happens is new drugs are priced lower than they are here, but the generics are priced higher. So if you look at the average bill that the Canadian pays for their pharmacy bill, if they paid it themselves as opposed to having it paid for through their government system, it's actually a little bit higher overall. And that's because people try to take generics more than they take brand name drugs. So consequently, what ends up happening in Canada is they actually pay a little bit more than we do on average. Of course, for a U.S. citizen, it makes perfect sense to go to Canada and get the new drugs, and it makes sense for the Canadians to come over here and get the generics.
Can you tell us a little bit about how the pharmaceutical industry works in Europe, too? Is it that much different than here in the United States? Do they have an equivalent to the FDA?
They do, but since they formed the European Union, they have... if you get an approval over there, you get it from the European Union, and you are on the market in all of the member countries, which actually has turned out to be a pretty good system. They actually have still, after the Kefauver Harris amendments, Britain and other European countries had many more drugs than we did on the market. They were made here in the U.S., but tested and put on the market first in Europe, and many were very life-saving drugs, by the way. And that's still happening. And so there are cancer patients, especially, going overseas to get specialized new treatments for particular cancers that are not available here in the U.S. Some of them are not going to be available for a long time, simply because the testing isn't going on here at the rate it needs to. So I think that's why Steve Jobs went overseas. He had what's called a NET cancer. It's a type of cancer that's usually you don't find till it's pretty late in the game. And they had a special treatment for it over there. And I don't know if he got it or not. I assume he did since he went overseas. And now they've really refined it quite a bit. It's something like is useful in 82% of the patients. So it's quite a breakthrough. It adds a couple years of life in over what chemotherapy gives you. So it's quite good. But here it's languishing here at the FDA. The FDA is just not interested in it.
All right, so let's bring it back to the U.S. And one of the bizarre consequences, I guess you could say, of the current process in the U.S. is that due to FDA regulations, it's very difficult or maybe even impossible to advertise that aspirin helps reduce heart attacks, even though it seems to be obvious to a lot of people. Can you talk about that a little bit and maybe some of the harmful effects of that?
Oh, yeah. Our knowledge about aspirin was one of the early casualties of the 1962 amendments because Bayer, aspirin, and squib were kind of excited about the idea of giving aspirin at a low dose to people because there already was evidence that would help people who were prone to heart disease. But the FDA told them all the things they'd have to do. And of course, aspirin was already a generic drug. So there's no patent protection. There's no way that the manufacturers could have recovered their costs. At least they didn't think so at the time. So they said, okay, well, we're not going to do these studies. So for many, many years, it wasn't until I think the mid 80s, it might have been the late 80s actually, when a study that had been funded through the government, actually found that aspirin could prevent cardiac events. And so then everybody was, of course, trying to take it. But we went, 20 some years without that knowledge that we could have had if the FDA hadn't stood in the way. Now, aspirin actually does several different things. And what the FDA has done is it's approved the language, the advertising language for aspirin for only certain indications and not others. So luckily for most Americans, if your doctor is prescribing aspirin, he probably knows all of the different indications that are possibilities. So hopefully that isn't holding too many people back. But the aspirin manufacturers themselves can only tell doctors certain things. The FDA has to approve the language that they can tell the doctors and advertise, to consumers.
Ooh.
And that's true for all drugs, actually. If a drug works, you put a drug on the market for something and find it works for something else, you can't tell the doctors about it. You can't tell the consumers about it until you've gone through more studies. And those studies are going to take long enough that by the time you do them, your drug will be off patent and all the generic manufacturers can use your data and advertise it too. So you're paying all the freight for everybody to talk about it. So
there's really no incentive.
Exactly. So what ends up happening is many companies start out with a new drug instead of using the old one. And the downside of that is, of course, they have to go through the entire 14-year process again. But it's also a safety issue because when you have a drug that's been around long enough for a second indication to, pop up, you probably have enough safety information on it that you know when it's good to give to people and when it's not. But this new drug, you don't have that information. So you're taking a bigger safety risk by putting out a new compound.
So could you tell us a bit about what the solutions would be? So we kind of know the problems with the FDA and some of the problems with delaying these drugs, but what are some of the solutions? Is it just as easy as getting rid of the Harris-Kefauver?
Yeah, what might this look like in a purely free market setting, I guess?
Well, in a totally free market setting, of course, it probably wouldn't be an FDA. What there would be is there would be what we call certifying agencies. Right now, the drug companies do all the studies that the FDA demands, and then they give the FDA literally a truckload of data. And in a certifying situation, what would happen is the drug companies would not be doing all the studies. These certifying agencies would probably be doing some of them and, testing to make sure that the drug is what the company says it is. And then they would give it their seal of approval if they agreed. And in fact, this is exactly what was happening before the Kefauver-Harris amendments. The AMA, the American Medical Association, did some of their own tests. And there's several organizations like Consumers Research that tested and had reports on, were the drugs good or not. There were several journals that devoted themselves to such tests and evaluations. So that has already happened in the past, and it would have been happening greatly now. In fact, though, to some extent it is. It's happening over the internet. A lot of users, of course, are getting on the internet and sharing their experiences. And there's also several new organizations that are starting to compile this information and putting it out there. So, that's really fairly easy to do now. So that would be one thing that would happen. And that's how Underwriters Laboratories works. They certify all the electrical equipment. If you turn over your electrical equipment and you see that little UL there, well, it's not a regulation. It's something that the electrical manufacturers go and pay a certifying fee to UL, and they test it. And if it's not working the way it's supposed to, they go back to the manufacturer and say, hey, you need to tweak this and that and the other thing so, it's safe. And then we can give you our seal of approval. And that's what happens. And of course, if they allow themselves to be bribed, so to speak, then their UL mark will lose its value, and people won't want to pay them to certify anymore. So they have a lot of incentive to make sure their mark is good. And that's what would happen in the drug industry as well if we had no FDA. There are some intermediate steps, of course, we could take, too. For example, if the European Union approves a drug, we could automatically be able to get it here. But the thing is, I don't think the FDA would ever agree to that because all the manufacturers would be going over to the European Union because they have a more reasonable process.
So I think we have time to ask you maybe about two more questions, and then we'll wrap up. One of the things I want to ask you about, and this is a very big topic, so we probably can't get too far into this, but crony capitalism in the pharmaceutical industry. We've seen the pharmaceutical industry having an influence over Obamacare being passed, over the Medicare Part D program from the Bush administration. Just how big a factor is crony capitalism within the pharmaceutical industry?
Well, it's huge because what happens with all these regulations is all the small competitors go out of business. It leaves the big conglomerates, and that's exactly what's been happening. All these companies have been merging because if the FDA decides at the last minute, after you've spent 14 years and almost $2 billion working on your drug, that they're not going to approve it, you have to be able to take that hit, and only a big giant company can do that. So bottom line is this should be expected. And when you have crony capitalism, when you have lots of regulations, you also have a situation where, in a sense, the regulators have been co-opted to some extent by the industry because it has to in self-defense. And the way that the drug industry has done this is to pass the Prescription Drug User Fee Act, which gives them the opportunity to pay a user fee, which now provides about half of the funding that the drug part of the FDA gets. So, of course, the FDA now feels like it owes the pharmaceutical companies approvals, and the other half of its money comes from Congress, and of course, Congress doesn't want any safety problems. So you could see that's a pretty tough line for the FDA to walk.
Yeah. One final question before we head out. With all of these intense regulations, one would hope that the FDA only ever approves very safe drugs. Are there any instances where the FDA has approved a drug and then it turned out to be unsafe?
Oh, there's many. In fact, there is no drug that's totally safe. This is the problem. If the FDA only approves safe drugs, it would be approving no drugs at all, because all drugs have a safety problem in some people. And so, it's an impossible task. So in some sense, I feel sympathy for the FDA, because they really are in a no-win situation. No matter what they do, it's the wrong thing. So, I think going back to what we talked about, these regulations, basically regulations can have side effects just like drugs can. And the regulations that the FDA works under have not been proven safe and effective, thereby flunking the very criteria that they lay out for the FDA.
Well, and I think there's even an organization called Worst Pills, Best Pills, where they have identified drugs that the FDA has identified that are unsafe and should be pulled. And I'm pretty sure they have pretty close, or maybe even at a 100% rate of those drugs eventually getting pulled. So that, yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, and that's a problem for some people, because the other flip side of that is for some people they work. So when the FDA takes a drug off the market, there is an uproar from the people who have been taking these drugs and for whom they have changed their life for the good. So, there is no drug that's perfect for everyone. So it really depends on what level of risk you're going to take, and it really depends on your genetics and probably factors we don't know anything about yet. So there really is no such thing as a bad drug, just like thalidomide. We're using thalidomide now to help cure leprosy and some cancers. So there really isn't a, quote, bad drug. It's just like thalidomide was bad for babies. Right. A certain segment of the population, it was good as a better sleeping pill because it killed fewer people.
Well, on that note, let me just add that we'll link, of course, to your website, ruwart.com. And before we go, is there anything else you'd like to promote? Any other place on the web or otherwise where people can find your work?
Well, my website is the portal to most, but I also am on Facebook. I have 2 Facebook sites which they can track. And I certainly recommend, there's many libertarian organizations have lots of information about the FDA and some of the downside of these things. So all you need to do is put in FDA and libertarian, and you'll get quite a few hits.
Oh, well, great. And do you have a Twitter account?
No, I don't. I probably should, but I don't.
Okay. All right. Well, we're in that. Well, I think Daniel might have one, but I'm in that position too. I probably should get one, but I don't have one. But anyways, on that note, I just want to remind our listeners to go to wakeupcallpodcast.com/FDA. That's the show notes page for this episode. We'll have links to follow Dr. Ruwart. We'll have links to some articles on this topic, and we'll have all sorts of other information there.
Thank you so much for coming on.
Yes, so thank you for joining us. And I feel like we covered a good amount of ground here on this very important topic that often gets overlooked. So thank you for helping us do that.
Oh, well, you're very welcome. I'm glad to do it because, unfortunately, there is so much about pharmaceuticals that are not well understood, and, of course, how regulations have really reshaped the pharmaceutical industry, the nutritional industry, and I will say even the medical industry. And it's important for Americans to know that.
All right. Well, thank you very much.
Well, thank you.
Thank you for listening to this episode of the Wake Up Call podcast.
If you would like to listen to more episodes, please subscribe, rate, and review the show on iTunes or subscribe on Stitcher. And check out our website at wakeupcallpodcast.com.
There you will find show notes pages and comment sections dedicated to the show. You can also email us at contact@wakeupcallpodcast.com if you're interested in being interviewed for the show or have any other suggestions.
Thank you.